How do you memorialize an entire iconic life on film? And in doing so, what part of that person's story are you responsible for documenting? I'm Erica Ishii, and we're talking biopics and creative responsibility today on Screen Junkies News. There is certainly no shortage of films documenting iconic lives, but in making a biopic, what responsibilities do the people behind the scenes and in front of the camera have when it comes to telling a person's life story? Joining me today to discuss are Markea McCarty and Dan Murrell. Thanks for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.
So, what responsibility do filmmakers have when telling somebody's life story?
I think that really more than anything, the responsibility is to not misrepresent that person, their beliefs, their life. There's always dramatic license taken, compression of events, the removal of events. But I think really what you owe it to that person is to not misrepresent who they were. And sometimes you do see that.
Yeah. I mean, it can happen, especially with license for dramatic purposes kind of a thing. But I think something that's equally as important as getting the feel of that actual person down is getting the feel of the era that they existed in, because that era, that location, that part of history that they made those choices in has a lot to do with the influencing of their behavior. So I think it's super important to get the feel of the time.
Absolutely. Very integral to the story. What do you think is more important when you're telling a person's life story? Is it the entire arc of their journey, or is it just like a pivotal moment or pivotal moments in their life?
I think that it can be anything. I think that sometimes you do need to kind of see an entire person's life to get perspective on who they are. Sometimes you don't. I feel like, Raging Bull, for example, which is one that I like, is it kind of tells a certain era of a person's life or a certain period, and that they kind of encompasses that person. I think it just depends on the subject. Some people have a period of their life that represents who they were. Sometimes you need more of a complete picture. Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of biopics where it's like they'll do the, they'll take you through the childhood first to then to that pivotal moment. And the best thing about biopics is that usually you know the people already. So like, Michael Jackson or any of the other biopics. While it's like, for instance, for a biopic that's out now, Hidden Figures, for instance, where it's like not a lot of people knew about the women that were involved in the NASA space program. Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, that are the lead characters of that particular movie. You don't necessarily, I'm not going to do any spoilers for it, but it's like you don't necessarily need to start from childhood and going through a journey up to that point when you're actually focusing in on, Project Mercury and then 1969, the Apollo 11 flight trajectories. It's like if you're focusing on that, you need to know the era, you need to know the personalities, and then you get to the heart of the matter. I feel like that would be important there.
Yeah, it also really depends on what makes a better movie in a lot of regards.
Very much. You don't want to get, I call it Dewey Cox syndrome, where it's like Dewey has to think about his whole life before he goes on the stage, which is and sometimes that can be done well. I think that's kind of a play on Walk the Line, which has that framing of, but yeah, sometimes I think that biopics feel this obligation to be like, I have to show them as a child. I have to show them in old age makeup. One of the things I hated the most about A Beautiful Mind, which is it's a Best Picture winner, and I think the middle of that movie or the beginning and middle of that movie are great, but I feel like it really kind of almost completely ruined itself because it felt obligated at the end to put Russell Crowe in old age makeup and to tie a bow on everything, and it's like, you don't always need to do that, I don't think. I think that sometimes just telling the story of who a person was and some of the events that happen in their lives, you don't need to close the loop necessarily by showing me where they are today. It's like that sometimes feels a little like
a little forced. Yeah. But so you too mentioned movies that you enjoyed that were biopics. You also have some picks for biopics that were not so great.
To continue with what Dan was saying, because you don't have to add You don't have to add a whole lot of plot devices to tell a story. Usually the person and the people around them are interesting enough that you don't have to keep on adding things. So for instance, Wired, the biopic for John Belushi in 1989, that's just, they added a lot of things that just they did not need to do. It was loosely based on Bob Woodard's bio about John Belushi, but then they also wrote Bob Woodard, the reporter, into it, and then they also added a guardian angel character to take John Belushi through. It's just, that's so unnecessary. It was, it was the 80s and cocaine's a hell of a drug, but still, I would love for them to revisit doing a biopic of John Belushi's life, and you don't have to have all of that. Yes, he's a comedian. Yes, he's a funny man, but there's tragedy in that comedy, and that's what you focus on.
Yeah, well, there are two that stand out for me that's like, it's not so much that these are terrible movies, but it was the waste of potential, and that is Oliver Stone did one called W. About George W. Bush. This is when he was still in office.
It was too soon.
And way too soon. And it fell victim to what I call SNL syndrome, which was it got bogged down by actors and makeup doing characters. And look, there's the Condoleezza Rice impression. There's the Dick Cheney impression. There's the Colin Powell impression. I thought that Josh Brolin did a good job, but it's like, the guy was still in office. I think he hadn't even been reelected yet. I think he came out in 2004. And it's like, if you're going to make a biopic about him, you've got to let history speak. You can't just, it was like a recitation of things that we already knew, and there wasn't really that much added to it. And it just felt like a waxworks almost. And the other one was one that was very recent, Steve Jobs, which I thought Aaron Sorkin, when I heard that Aaron Sorkin was going to do the Steve Jobs biopic, I'm like, oh, wow, because he did such a great job with Social Network. And I felt like that movie was crippled by Sorkin's decision to be like, this is going to be set in 3 different scenes, and but they still tried to tell it in the other way too. It couldn't quite commit to one way. It came off as staged to me, very stagey. It fell really flat. Again, it had that kind of maudlin bow at the end of it that it didn't need, and I felt like if Aaron Sorkin had approached it more conventionally, he could have done a great job. And there are some great things in that movie. That's what makes it so frustrating. I thought Seth Rogen as Steve Wozniak was great in that movie, and Michael Fassbender's great in that movie. But I think just structurally, I really was disappointed in that movie, and I thought it had greatness in it.
2 Steve Jobs films that year.
Yeah. The Ashton Kutcher one and the Michael Fassbender one. Yeah, a lot of people like Steve Jobs. I just felt like it was a really big missed opportunity for me personally.
Well, thanks so much for sharing all your thoughts on it, everybody. I really appreciate you coming by. So what are some of your favorite biopics, and what are some biopics that you would like to see? Please let us know in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe, and check out our other videos here. Take care.